For 23 years, I walked into boardrooms where decisions bent economies and signatures altered industries. My value wasn't written on certificates or celebrated in corporate newsletters. It lived in late-night calls with foreign regulators, in discreet dinners where deals were saved, and in contracts translated before they ever reached legal departments. I negotiated in English, debated in French, persuaded in Mandarin, reassured in German, and built trust in Korean. Language was not a skill. It was a weapon. Yet on that Monday morning, none of it mattered to the new CEO. He was young, overly confident, and convinced that leadership was performance. He entered the briefing room like a man descending a staircase built from his own ego. He didn't greet the Korean delegation. He didn't shake hands with investors who had flown across oceans. He tossed his tablet on the table and acted as if the room was waiting for his brilliance. I remained silent, seated at my usual spot, reviewing the merger notes that would determine whether our company expanded globally or remained a regional relic. He stared at me with the impatience of someone who equated age with irrelevance. The merger briefing was minutes from beginning when he leaned back in his chair, smirked, and delivered his verdict on my career in 4 words. "Fetch coffee. Let the smart people talk." Executives chuckled, eager to align with power. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. The Korean delegation stiffened, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to insulted restraint. In Korean business culture, hierarchy is respected but never abused. Ordering a senior colleague to act like a servant wasn't a breach of etiquette, it was a declaration of incompetence. In less than a second, the CEO transformed potential partners into silent opponents. I didn't respond. Anger wastes clarity, and clarity was the one advantage arrogance never anticipates. I stood up without argument, but my departure wasn't obedience. It was reconnaissance. From the hallway, I watched the CEO attempt to dominate the discussion. He interrupted translators, laughed at nuanced questions, and dismissed financial concerns as administrative noise. He believed that confidence replaced preparation. He thought volume was negotiation. He failed to notice that every polite nod from the Korean chairman was not agreement but withdrawal. While he spoke, I reviewed the merger framework in my mind. I knew the clauses they would reject, the terms they found disrespectful, and the cultural traps he was stepping into. I could already see the breakdown forming. If he continued, they wouldn't just decline the deal, they would blacklist the company. The CEO was playing poker with a language he didn't understand, bluffing with a hand made entirely of ego. My phone vibrated. A junior associate whispered that the Koreans were confused by the CEO's dismissal of me. To them, stripping authority from a seasoned negotiator meant the company didn't respect institutional memory. They interpreted it as instability. Their expressions weren't annoyance. They were warning signals. I walked back toward the boardroom, not to serve coffee, but to assess the battlefield. When I stopped by the doorway, the CEO paused mid-sentence and raised an eyebrow, expecting a tray in my hands. He didn't understand that every step I took was a calculation. If he wanted hierarchy, he would pay for misunderstanding it. If he wanted authority, he would learn its cost. In that moment, I realized something profound. Arrogance doesn't collapse overnight. It builds scaffolding around itself until reality removes a single beam. That single beam was me. He ordered coffee. I began preparing a lesson worth $120 million. The CEO's leadership style resembled a power drill, always spinning, never measuring, and convinced every surface could be forced to fit his blueprint. He entered negotiations believing business was warfare, and the loudest general always won. To him, success came from domination, not understanding. He ignored the reality that global markets are built on culture, context, and the silent mathematics of respect. In his mind, foreign partners existed to validate his ideas, not to challenge them. The notion of learning from them insulted him. He expected compliance, not collaboration. The Korean delegation observed him with faces carved from discipline. Koreans rarely display open irritation, but their silence contained volumes. Their concept of, loosely translated as saving face, guided every interaction. It's not vanity, it's honor, dignity, and mutual preservation. deals in South Korea are not signatures. They are relationships built, tested, and measured over time. The CEO saw none of that. He believed acknowledgement meant surrender. He mistook respectful pauses as submission. He interpreted quiet glances between the delegates as admiration when in truth they were discreet warnings. He introduced aggressive clauses to the merger agreement that contradicted Korean business etiquette. He slashed grace periods, demanded unilateral decision-making authority, and insisted negotiations skip ceremonial introductions. He dismissed welcome dinners, handshake rituals, and the exchange of business cards with both hands as unnecessary formalities. He didn't understand that each gesture was a pillar. Removing one meant nothing. Removing all of them meant collapse. He walked through customs of another nation as if he owned them. The boardroom mirrored his arrogance. Executives nodded with rehearsed enthusiasm, terrified to contradict the man with the title. They trusted his academic pedigree more than the quiet results I delivered over decades. They measured capability in certificates, not outcomes. While I spent years repairing damaged partnerships and recovering lost supply chains, he spent hours rehearsing speeches designed to impress shareholders. The board could not see that impressive diction didn't translate into international rapport. They confused fluency with superiority. They assumed experience was optional. During the early negotiation sessions, the CEO repeatedly interrupted the Korean chairman, believing brevity equaled efficiency. He insisted discussions skip cultural pleasantries and dive straight to money. He saw courtesy as wasted time. He forgot that time is the currency of trust. By ignoring ceremony, he signaled that he valued cash over credibility. Koreans don't invest in contracts first. They invest in character. Without it, no number is safe. Every condition the CEO imposed chipped away at the foundation. When Koreans nodded, he grinned as if he had conquered their doubts. He didn't grasp that nodding in their culture isn't agreement. It's an invitation to continue without confrontation. The CEO heard confirmation where only patience existed. He saw victory where the battlefield had not yet been chosen. Each nod was not acceptance. It was a countdown. It marked the distance between his ignorance and their exit strategy. Rumors traveled quickly. Other Asian partners began delaying responses. Suppliers subtly extended timelines. Former allies requested clarifications that never used to be necessary. What he called progress was actually erosion. He interpreted silence as submission because he had never stood in rooms where words were weapons and silence could be a guillotine. The CEO was building a deal on assumptions, blind confidence, and cultural negligence. He didn't recognize that negotiations are not competitions. They are ecosystems. When one side fails to understand the rules, the system doesn't break, it ejects the offender. He mistook Korean composure for weakness, unaware that the calmest oceans conceal the deepest currents. He didn't realize it yet, but the deal wasn't expanding the company. It was measuring him. And every nod from the Koreans was a silent conclusion. This man has no idea what he is losing. The tension inside the boardroom thickened the moment the CEO dismissed my presence with a wave of his hand. I remained seated near the far end of the table, quietly observing, my notepad untouched. The Korean delegation exchanged polite smiles, masking a shift beneath the surface. For them, language was not merely communication, it was identity, hierarchy, and intent. They transitioned from English to Korean as seamlessly as a door closing without a sound. The CEO assumed this was harmless chatter, unimportant background noise. To him, foreign languages were decorations, not instruments. The delegation spoke calmly, but dissected our leadership with surgical precision. They questioned the CEO's impulsiveness, his disregard for etiquette, and his refusal to consider cultural context. They wondered how a corporation of our size allowed someone so inexperienced to lead critical international negotiations. They described him not as a strategist, but as a reckless gambler who believed confidence was capital. Their tone was never raised, but every syllable carried weight. What the CEO mistook for whispering was, in reality, an autopsy of his credibility. Their dialogue shifted to alternatives. They analyzed other companies capable of fulfilling the merger, naming competitors willing to respect protocol and preserve dignity. They discussed timelines for withdrawal and potential repercussions for aligning with leadership they deemed unstable. Each phrase was a thread unraveling months of preparation. The CEO, clueless, tapped his pen impatiently, convinced silence meant progress. I listened, not because I wished to undermine him, but because I understood the battlefield he refused to acknowledge. Every sentence became evidence. Each observation was a negotiation tool hidden in plain sight. The Koreans weren't emotional, they were strategic. Their criticism wasn't aimed at humiliation. It was reconnaissance. They were mapping the weakness of our house, brick by brick. The CEO saw nods and smiles. I saw the door closing one hinge at a time. When the discussion reached a critical point, the CEO interrupted. He leaned back, smirked, and commanded me to summarize the exchange, assuming I had spent the last 10 minutes staring at the wall. He expected obedience, not intelligence. To him, language fluency was a luxury skill, something younger employees added to resumes for aesthetics. He never considered it might be the keystone of everything he was about to lose. I stood slowly, allowing silence to settle. The executives watched with impatience, confident I would confirm the CEO's delusions. The Korean delegation turned their heads sharply, prepared to witness another gesture of disrespect. Instead, I faced their chairman, locked eyes with him, and spoke in flawless, culturally appropriate Korean. The first words struck the room like a dropped glass. Conversations halted mid-breath. The chairman's eyebrows lifted, not in surprise, but in recognition of someone who had listened, understood, and valued meaning beyond vocabulary. My sentences carried respect, clarity, and fluency so precise it erased the CEO's mockery in an instant. I addressed every concern the delegation expressed, acknowledged the weight of their honor, and clarified that not all of us mistook politeness for weakness. The chairman's posture changed. His shoulders relaxed, and a faint nod appeared, not the deceptive one used earlier, but the kind given to appear. Contempt dissolved. Respect took its place. The investors stared at me differently, recalibrating their assumptions. The executives who once ignored my presence now looked as if I had materialized from a fog they never bothered to see through. The CEO didn't move. His smirk vanished, replaced by confusion that slowly transformed into fear. He finally realized I wasn't the man who fetched coffee. I was the man who understood the room. And in negotiations, comprehension is power. At that moment, the delegation no longer viewed me as an overlooked employee. I became the bridge they never expected and the wall the CEO could not climb. The moment I spoke Korean, the room recalibrated. The shift was not dramatic or loud. It was quiet, calculated, and irreversible. The Korean delegation, who had previously endured the CEO's arrogance in restrained silence, now redirected every fragment of dialogue toward me. Their questions bypassed the man with the title and landed squarely on the man with the understanding. They asked about projections, timelines, compliance risks, and transitional allowances. Their tone was crisp, as if they had been waiting for a competent voice to surface. The CEO's expression hardened. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched the armrests of his chair. He tried to interrupt once, clearing his throat loudly, but the chairman continued speaking without even acknowledging him. The humiliation wasn't theatrical, it was surgical. Respect had changed hands, and everyone in the room felt it. Investors leaned forward. Executives who once dismissed me now scribbled notes furiously, trying to catch up with a narrative they never expected. The CEO had become an observer in his own meeting. As the conversation deepened, the Koreans probed weaknesses in the merger structure, areas the CEO hadn't considered. I addressed each concern meticulously. I explained the cultural implications of certain clauses he had imposed, highlighted potential diplomatic backlash, and offered adjustments that preserved dignity for both sides. Every sentence I delivered repaired damage the CEO never realized he caused. The board members exchanged glances, their faces reflecting something they had not anticipated: relief. They finally saw what competence looked like. The CEO tried again to reclaim the spotlight. He leaned forward, lifted a hand, and forced out a laugh, hoping to dissolve the tension. No one reacted. Even laughter requires authority, and his had evaporated. The Korean delegation's silence toward him was not rudeness, it was elimination. They did not confront him. They erased him. In Asian business etiquette, ignoring someone is the purest form of dismissal. The CEO had wanted dominance. He received invisibility. The more I spoke, the more the narrative shifted. My answers weren't rehearsed. They were the product of years lived in the trenches, resolving disputes at midnight, renegotiating contracts over cold meals, absorbing customs from cultures leadership pretended to understand. The CEO had credentials. I had currency. And currency spends itself without introduction. By the final quarter of the meeting, the atmosphere resembled a tribunal disguised as a negotiation. Investors whispered to each other, recalculating risk exposure. A few executives stared at the CEO as if seeing him for the first time, not as a leader, but as a liability. For a man accustomed to attention, the absence of acknowledgement struck harder than criticism. Silence had weaponized itself, and he stood directly in its line of fire. Then came the moment that fractured the room's balance permanently. As the meeting closed, the Korean chairman requested a private exchange. We stepped into a side office lined with minimalist decor and a panoramic view of the city. He stood without expression, hands clasped behind his back, absorbing the weight of the silence. He asked, in measured English, "Are you comfortable working under someone who does not respect his own assets?" For a second, time folded. The question wasn't simple. It wasn't even about me. It was about them. It was an assessment disguised as diplomacy. He was asking whether the company deserved a partner that valued what it possessed. He wasn't questioning my loyalty. He was questioning their judgment. There was no anger in his tone. No threat. Only inevitability. His inquiry was a mirror held against leadership, an invitation to recognize what they were destroying through ignorance. At that moment, I understood the truth. The CEO had not lost control. He had surrendered it, quietly, blindly, and without knowing. The chairman's question echoed in my mind long after we returned to the boardroom. By then, the outcome was no longer uncertain. The Koreans had mentally left the table. All that remained was a ceremonial exit. I knew corporate collapse rarely arrives with a bang. It slips into inboxes, wraps itself in polite vocabulary, and detonates with punctuation. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and composed an email that would alter the trajectory of the company in less than 6 sentences. The termination notice was not emotional. It was architectural. Every word aligned with Korean business etiquette, formal, measured, and undeniably respectful. I acknowledged their time, commended the potential of collaboration, and expressed regret over the inability to reach a mutually sustainable framework. Then I introduced the knife, concerns regarding leadership stability. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't reveal conversations. I let implication do what accusations never can: force reflection. Stability in Korean culture is not negotiable. It is the spine of trust. Questioning it without hostility was enough to fracture the entire deal. At the bottom of the email, I wished them prosperity, attached a digital seal, and clicked send. There was no dramatic gesture, no triumphant sigh. The screen dimmed slightly, and with it, $120 million evaporated. We had spent years positioning the company for global expansion, but it took one misguided leader to dismantle that bridge before we stepped onto it. The Koreans replied within 10 minutes. Their acceptance was concise, free of anger, and devastatingly final. They thanked us for the opportunity, reaffirmed their respect for my professionalism, and expressed hope that future collaborations might occur under different circumstances. Those final words were not courtesy, they were indictment. They weren't rejecting the company. They were rejecting its commander. The CEO was oblivious. He strutted around the office, confident the deal was secured, bragging about impending press releases and expanded market presence. He paraded through hallways like a victorious general. But generals require armies, and he had none. Instead, he had executives who watched silently as he marched toward a cliff. The illusion shattered when the board summoned everyone to the executive floor. The screens displayed financial dashboards drenched in red. Withdrawal notices from investors flickered like emergency alerts. Our stock had begun to slide even before official news broke. Word had leaked, not of failure, but of instability. In global markets, perception is currency, and we were bankrupt without declaring it. The CEO stepped forward, voice raised, demanding explanations. He blamed communication issues, cultural misunderstanding, and eventually, me. He claimed I sabotaged the deal, exceeded authority, and undermined corporate vision. His words bounced around the room with diminishing impact. The board listened, not to his accusations, but to the consequences they could not ignore. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. Defense implies guilt. I allowed numbers to speak, the language his ego never studied. Profit projections cut in half. Shareholder confidence plummeting. Competitors launching aggressive campaigns targeting markets we would never enter. The CEO believed leadership was noise. The board now understood leadership was signal. A board member asked the CEO why the Koreans refused further negotiation. He mumbled, deflected, and stammered through excuses. He could not articulate what he never understood. Then another member turned to me, requesting clarification. I delivered a brief, factual summary, no embellishment, no pride. Silence followed. Not awkward silence, judgmental silence. It echoed louder than argument. The CEO looked around for allies. None met his eyes. A single email had dismantled the illusion he mistook for strategy. He had demanded coffee. I served consequences. And the invoice was paid in millions. The boardroom felt different after the emergency session. Gone were the forced smiles that usually accompanied executive gatherings. The table that once served as a stage for the CEO's monologues had become an autopsy slab, and what lay before them was not the body of a failed deal, it was the corpse of their assumptions. For years, they measured worth through titles, age, and presentation. Now they were forced to examine the architecture behind results, and to their surprise, it had my signature engraved on every beam. Executives who once walked past me in hallways without acknowledgement now positioned their chairs closer. Their tone shifted from condescension to curiosity. They had always seen me as part of the machine, reliable, unremarkable, silent. But machines don't negotiate international contracts, salvage hostile deals, or defuse crises at dawn. Machines don't speak 5 languages with the precision required to avoid diplomatic incidents. Machines don't build bridges that save corporations from collapse. People do. And they had mistaken a pillar for wallpaper. One board member opened a thick personnel file, my personnel file. It was older than some executives in the room, a documented chronicle of decades spent fixing what others broke. Project after project carried annotations of recovery plans I implemented. Supplier renegotiations I orchestrated. Compliance issues I resolved. Markets I opened through cultural diplomacy, not brute force. They uncovered emails from foreign partners praising my discretion. Letters from regulators thanking me for clarity. Internal memos where crises dissolved because I acted before headlines could form. The deeper they read, the more the atmosphere shifted. Respect didn't arrive as applause. It arrived as silence, the kind that emerges when truth collides with ego. For years, the CEO's bravado buried my contributions under noise. He mistook confidence for leadership and presentation for intelligence. He assumed knowledge was decoration. But while he was polishing speeches, I was preventing disasters he never knew were coming. A particularly revealing moment came when the head of risk management uncovered a folder labeled Critical Interventions. Inside were summaries of incidents the CEO had never even heard about, a supplier bankruptcy in Singapore I intercepted before it disrupted production, a customs discrepancy in Frankfurt I resolved quietly to avoid litigation. A compliance breach in Canada I corrected before auditors arrived. Each incident could have cost millions. Each one was neutralized without ceremony. The board realized these successes weren't accidents, they were infrastructure. The CEO tried to salvage authority. He claimed that leadership didn't require technical involvement. He argued that vision was more important than detail. His words, once accepted as doctrine, now sounded like excuses uttered by a man who never understood the foundation he was standing on. The board finally saw his leadership style for what it was: performance without substance. He had insulted me publicly, but that wasn't his real mistake. His real mistake was assuming that infrastructure had no voice. A senior board member closed my file gently, as if handling evidence in a courtroom. She looked around the room and spoke with a calm finality. "We misinterpreted loyalty as silence," she said, "and silence as insignificance." Another member added, "Competence doesn't shout. It prevents shouting." The CEO's face paled. He wasn't losing a deal anymore. He was losing the illusion that protected him. They didn't discover a forgotten employee. They discovered the system behind their survival. They realized too late that they had never insulted a man. They had insulted an infrastructure that carried them. The boardroom that once reflected the CEO's authority now resembled a courtroom. The verdict had been sealed before anyone spoke it aloud. When the chairman announced his demotion, there was no shock, no breathless disbelief, only resignation. The CEO sat rigid, still clinging to the illusion that leadership was a chair and not a responsibility. His title evaporated, and with it, the shield that had protected his ignorance. He didn't lose power. He had never possessed it. He merely occupied a space others assumed required wisdom. The board turned toward me with a reverence I had never seen in their eyes. Their expressions carried the weight of apology, gratitude, and desperation blended into a single gaze. They offered the CEO's seat with solemnity, as though passing a crown. To them, I represented stability, multilingual diplomacy, and a skill set that couldn't be fabricated. They believed the position was a reward, the pinnacle of recognition, but they misunderstood me again. Titles do not make leaders. Titles restrain leaders. A chair can be a throne or a cage. I declined without hesitation. Not out of spite nor pride, but understanding. The CEO's downfall had taught me one lesson: authority attracts scrutiny, but influence moves unseen. A leader with a title is chained to expectations. A strategist with no title controls outcomes without being targeted. I had survived the arrogance of a man who worshipped perception. I refused to become another prisoner of optics. The board looked stunned, unsure whether they had been rejected or enlightened. Instead, I proposed a different arrangement. I would become a strategic consultant, free from bureaucratic ritual, accountable only to results. My work would be measured in decisions that prevented disasters, not in speeches or photo opportunities. The board accepted instantly. They needed stability more than symbolism. My hourly rate exceeded what the CEO once earned in a month. For the first time in my career, compensation reflected contribution, not costume. Word spread beyond the company's walls. Other corporations reached out, intrigued by the man who canceled a multi-million-dollar deal with an email and salvaged his employer from reputational ruin. They didn't hire me because I looked important. They hired me because I understood the language of leverage, literal and metaphorical. I spoke the dialects that closed doors, opened markets, and decoded silence. In boardrooms across continents, executives now paused before underestimating the quiet one. My first consulting engagement was with a logistics firm struggling to enter East Asian markets. Within days, I uncovered the cultural missteps that stunted their expansion. I corrected proposals, restructured communication, and bridged gaps their executives didn't know existed. They paid the invoice without negotiation. They understood value when they saw it. My influence expanded without the weight of ownership. Each contract felt like vindication, not revenge, but recognition. Meanwhile, the former CEO drifted through the company like a relic. His demotion stripped him of audience and authority. People avoided eye contact, unsure whether to pity or ignore him. He discovered the painful truth he once mocked: competence earns respect before it demands recognition. His downfall wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like a building losing foundation one unnoticed crack at a time. My consultancy flourished. I chose my clients, my hours, and my influence. I walked into negotiations without a badge announcing status, yet people listened before I spoke. They sensed, intuitively, that knowledge doesn't shout. It whispers and moves mountains. The board had offered me a throne. I built a kingdom instead. A kingdom where titles meant nothing and understanding meant everything. Where influence lived beyond office walls. where the most powerful person was not the one who sat at the head of the table, but the one who could speak the language no one else heard. Time has a peculiar way of turning humiliation into heritage. The story that began with a single command spoken casually, delivered arrogantly, received silently, has become more than a corporate anecdote. It has evolved into a cautionary tale repeated in closed-door retreats, whispered at executive dinners, and dissected in leadership seminars. I never intended to become anyone's lesson. Yet today, my experience serves as a mirror for those who believe authority can replace understanding and confidence can substitute competence. The irony is not that the CEO lost a deal. Deals collapse every day. Markets shift. Strategies misfire. The true tragedy lies in the preventable nature of the failure. He didn't lose because our company lacked talent. He lost because he refused to acknowledge it. The board once believed leadership meant direction, not comprehension. The CEO believed respect was optional. Both assumptions proved costly. Leadership without listening is negligence disguised as ambition. Soon after my departure from the corporate hierarchy, invitations began flooding my inbox. Organizations wanted me to speak about cross-cultural intelligence, linguistic leverage, and silent authority. Professionals expected dramatic tales of revenge, but what I offered was simpler. Competence does not fight, it functions. The collapse of the merger wasn't something I engineered. It was something I allowed. Arrogance did the rest. Executives often ask how a single sentence could trigger millions in losses. They expect a dramatic conspiracy, a personal vendetta, or a cleverly orchestrated trap. They struggle to accept that the downfall came from a misread moment, 4 words issued without thought, dismissed as harmless. But leadership is not measured by intent. It is measured by impact. A careless command can demolish alliances. Disrespect can poison partnerships before signatures dry. The CEO told me to fetch coffee. In that instant, he informed the Koreans that intellect was undervalued in our C-suite. They responded accordingly. My new career grew rapidly. Companies hired me not because I promised miracles, but because I understood the silent rules of global commerce. They valued my ability to interpret cultures, dismantle assumptions, and highlight risks that executives never perceived. My invoices were not questioned. Payment arrived faster than meeting requests. Influence without obligation proved more liberating than any title the board could have offered. At conferences, I watch CEOs shift uneasily when my story is introduced. They expect motivational rhetoric. Instead, they receive a warning. I describe leadership as stewardship, not dominance. I explain that every employee is a potential gatekeeper of the company's survival. When ignored, they become dormant volcanoes, silent until provoked. I never raised my voice. I never plotted sabotage. I merely stopped protecting a leader who believed I served no purpose. The system delivered the consequences. The former CEO faded into obscurity. His resume lists achievements without context, victories without acknowledgement of the foundations he didn't build. His downfall wasn't a scandal. It was a recalibration. He didn't commit fraud. He committed ignorance. In a world where perception moves capital, ignorance is the most expensive transaction of all. Years later, executives still approach me after speeches, repeating my words as if reciting scripture. They are not inspired. They are unsettled. They ask how to avoid similar collapse. My response is always the same. Hire wisdom before arrogance, and never confuse silence with insignificance. Titles announce authority. Results reveal it. I didn't destroy the CEO's deal. I didn't sabotage his leadership. I didn't orchestrate downfall. He brewed his own collapse the moment he mistook a human asset for a servant. He told me to fetch coffee. I spoke Korean. And the world learned the price of disrespect.